I'm Tom Ray from the Electronic Production and Design Department of Berklee College of Music in Boston. No, that's not California. It is in Boston. And that's the commercial. That's why I got the travel money.
You got that Boston accent.
Oh, yeah. Southie in Boston. Okay, so let's get going here. Most of what I'm going to say about historical stuff can be found, unfortunately, out of print, but in The Art of Electronic Music, which is essentially a compilation that Keyboard Magazine did. And part of that compilation is my some 54 electronic perspectives columns from 1977 to 1981. I'm very happy to say that Wally DeBacker has graciously scanned those for me, and we're going to have a monograph in publication eventually for people that just want a little thumbnail history of this kind of stuff. So, these are the kinds of images that I supplied for those columns and subsequently back into this compilation by Keyboard. Let's start with the theremin because we're going to talk about stepless pitch instruments, which means no steps. I mean, it has an implication of analog, but of course nowadays with digital becoming so much more fine, human perception being what it is, digital can essentially do stepless pitches. So let's start with the theremin, and I've got a thing from Steve Martin's film, which I'd like to show just first to give a little bit of a perspective on the theremin, hoping that PowerPoint works. 2, 3, 4, because if you don't wait till it loads, it won't work. Good. Hang on. Better? Lev Theremin, Leon Theremin, Gallicized in France, of course. That's where you'd Gallicize things. Music from the ether. One of the earliest electronic musical instruments, not electromechanical. There are many things earlier than that. Here's theremin. This is kind of a painting, really. That's a speaker. That's a theremin. Everybody recognizes that. I always like to know where my technology comes from. Electronic music is always ridden like a flea on the back of a dog on bigger technologies. I think a speaker before me mentioned that, we didn't have A to D and D to A conversion before the CD, and then you had a reasonable kind of cheap chip, not $300-400. And you see here radio technology, and that's what the early instruments were, the Trautonium, the theremin, the Ondes Martenot. They came out of radio technology. A lot of people don't realize how uptown these instruments were in their day. They hear them in horror movies now, and they sort of assume, that's what they were. Here is theremin on the left, playing theremin. That's his accompanist, Frank Chatterton. I'm sorry I don't know the two singers, but on the right is Nadia Reisenberg, who married and became, Clara Reisenberg, who married and became Clara Rockmore, one of the grand dames of theremin lore. Here's a picture from Carnegie Hall. 8, 10 theremins? I always theorized that it sounded a little like a dying calf in a hailstorm. Bob Moog, was his opinion that the theremin was, quote, the most novel and so forth, and the most difficult instrument to play. I concur with that. And when you hear the transcendent playing that Rob did yesterday, I am blown away. When you have a marketing success, well, you try to expand it. Here's the theremin keyboard, which was obviously polyphonic. That's theremin tuning it individually, by the way. I guess it could have been microtonal. And the theremin cello, Wallingford Rieger was said to have played this, and the terpsitone, the theremin dance stage, on which I think Clara danced a version of the Bach Gounod Ave Maria, and there was talk of a three-dimensional theremin. God help us. It's sort of like, you remember those old magazines where we were all going to fly to work in a helicopter? Whoa. 2 dimensions is tough enough. Now, you start getting 3, well, it didn't work out. I collect things that were said about the future that were silly. Wonderful album was made by Shirley and Robert Moog, Clara Rockmore theremin. This is on Delos, I believe. Premier artiste of the electronic music medium. The LPs are gone. It was wonderful gatefold, but the CD is still available to my knowledge. It's mostly transcriptions, very little original stuff, but it's gorgeous. And now I'll do this little trip from Steve Martin's film, not the comedian, but the filmmaker. That's Clara Rockmore in her advanced years. Why is it called ether music, by the way? Do you know? Well, no. What happened is in the 19th century, physicists did not know that light can be both a wave and a particle. That understanding wasn't extant. And they were trying to figure out, well, how does all that energy get from millions of miles away from the sun and come to the earth and make IR, infrared? How can this work? Reasoning by analogy of sound, you need a material elastic medium through which sound must pass, propagate. Okay? So they said, well, there must be something there. There must be something in outer space. And like any good scientist, they engaged in swag. Scientific wild-ass guessing. And I tell my students, we're artists, we can certainly engage in swag if scientists can do it. So they made up the luminiferous ether. And for many years, physicists believed that there was this stuff in outer space. Turns out, no. A few years later, it came to pass. No, it's a particle, it's a wave, it's Cheerios, it's whatever you want it to be. I brought this up because I see a natural lineage between Leon Theremin, Bob Moog, and Lippold Haken. The stepless pitch idea in the theremin, which is all it does, it's absolutely that. Then to the Moog, where you have glide, which, by the way, it can now be confirmed that Wendy Carlos actually asked for glide. And the reason it can be confirmed is because I have now found my 1970 interview that I did with Bob Moog, with some help from my friends, Wally DeBacker, and people that think my career matters, so that's handy. Let's see. Oh, that's the first synthesizer, 2 oscillators and 2 VCAs. I fished this out of Bob Moog's trash can. Seriously. I said, Bob, what's this? Oh, it's an old brochure. It's a picture. Oh, please. Okay, so that's the longest thing I've got. Let's dip a few, and maybe I'll knock a few of these off or play them from the center. I must play, though, my favorite artist on the theremin. Hands down, bar none, absolutely the creme de la creme.
Rob, you gotta watch it.
I've lost thousands of gigs this moment. Which one hands down the floor?
Yeah, that's the
Keep
best.
watching. Keep watching. Keep watching. It's right at the end.
What does it mean? or if this cat's an actor, what's my motivation? You play better than the cat, Rob. I'll give it to you. There's all kinds of people that have played the theremin, and the fact that I play a few excerpts doesn't mean a whole lot. It doesn't mean that I'm excluding or including, and I sometimes will play things that I think people maybe haven't seen, so that explains some of it. Midsummer Murders. Yeah.
Why so many female thereminists and so few female continuum players?
I don't have an answer for that, but obviously everybody has noticed that Clara Rockmore, Lucy Bigelow Rosen, and I've got a dozen others in all of my files here. I'm loaded with information here that are female theremin players. Say again?
I
didn't.
Counting.
I'm just getting in touch with my feminine side.
I'm not going to touch that with a 10-foot pole.
Please don't.
Yeah. I'm going to play a little bit of Pamela Kirsten because it's pretty startling. And I'll truncate that a little bit. We could play a little of Percy Granger's, or an impression of it from Lydia Kavina, but I do want to, try to make up some of the time here. So let me just play a couple of things that are not electronic, just so. Oh, wait a minute. They're electronic, but not ether. I still call them ether instruments. The Ondes Martenot. They're heterodyning instruments, basically. Two very high oscillators, and then you modulate one of them, and you hear the difference tone. Now, when you do that, you tend to get that kind of oscillator tends to be an LC oscillator, which makes a sine wave. Well, what do you do with a sine wave? Well, you pass it through the nonlinear parts of triode tubes and stuff like that, and you make different sounds. But of course, you don't get sawtooths, you don't get pulses. This comes from a different stream of the history. these kinds of instruments or these LC oscillators, they have this ooh kind of sound, and it's obvious in all of them. Let's see, what do I want to play here? Well, the most obvious is the Beach Boys, Good Vibrations, was not played on a space control instrument. Oh, you may have noticed the lady playing the Midsummer Murders thing. It was out of sync because it was mimed, It
Miming theremin is the weirdest thing ever. I had to do that for a film. So I recorded this part, and then you play back, and it really feels, since it doesn't feel like anything, it really feels like you're playing. So something just slightly different happens. You go, what the?
Is that why I heard you sing "Oops" while that one was playing?
Yeah.
Here's Dark Shadows, the TV thing a lot of people have heard. No, it's not a theremin.
That was the Tannerin also, right?
I'm not sure. I thought it was a Moog synthesizer. By the way, the thing that the Beach Boys were playing originally, they had a Tannerin, but I understood that Bob actually made them a linear instrument like
Melsonar.
Was it
Melsonar?
Melsonar.
And that was actually it in the video.
That was Bob's.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. And then there's Portishead. The usual dead giveaway of synthesizers is the vibrato is an LFO that goes wow, 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 wow. Even if you have a modulation wheel where you can modulate the depth of it, of course more advanced synthesizers have both rate and depth control. But we were talking yesterday, and Sally mentioned, I said, well, no. She said, no, you are the envelope. You are the LFO. And that is the fundamental difference, in my opinion, as an historian of all this stuff, between synthesizers and what I would call more organic instruments. This is kind of interesting. Let's look a little bit. Wendy had this thing called a circular controller. This is kind of cool.
This is something we call the circular controller, and we shorthandedly refer to it as a CirCon, circular controller, get it? And it's a control instrument that we built for The Shining. When we asked Stanley what kind of music was he listening to, and he said, things like Sibelius's False Trees. And we thought, that's a lovely piece. And ya, 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 ya. And instead of playing that with a keyboard-like synthesizer, which we had the Moog, we thought we'd build an instrument especially for it that could do a singing voice. And this is it here. And I'll show you what it sounds like.
Yeah, well, you're halfway there. Musical instruments, and again, as the speakers have said several times during this convention, they float in a sea of pitch. I'll claim that as my comment. I don't care. They're not fixed. They're not terraced like keyboards, traditional keyboards. They float in a sea of pitch, and I'll show you many examples of that. These are some of the most popular instruments of these things. There were antecedents, by the way, 30s, 50s, wobble organ, for that invention. Oh, well, I have to play this because Randy's here. And I saw him and I said, wait a minute, I know you. Now, Randy spilled the beans, and of course, everybody in the room knows this is how music gets made today. It gets edited together. You know, back when I played with orchestras, you know, you don't do that. I mean, that doesn't happen. Even when Glenn Gould came in and became our first technologist, in a sense, Schillinger was the first, I guess, but Glenn Gould was actually a wonderful technologist. He quit his concert career. He said, well, there's no point to this. You know, it's the studio. And he would take the best cuts of what he played, and, you know, they would mash them together, and that would become what they published. But at any rate, there's so many places to go with this stuff. Yeah, I'll do it here while we're talking about the theremin. Like I said, there's a natural lineage between the theremin and the Ondes Martenot and Bob Moog. Bob Moog built theremin kits to get through school, just the superficial aspect of it. But the idea of glide, of portamento, more accurate, was a big part of the Moog synthesizers. It tickled people's ears. Wow, what is that? You know, acoustic instruments can't glide over many octaves. You know, only electronic things do that. And this is a great example. This was a big tune. Of course, anybody knew in the old days about synthesizers, you could play the glide control. You don't have to set it and let it sit there. You could play it, which many people did because they recognized portamento is individual per context. And one of the things that synthesizers did not do well is context. Let me... while I'm on portamento, let me just quickly do this. I'm not even sure I'll play this. This is the Raymond Scott Clavivox. Raymond and Bob had a nice relationship, and I had a nice relationship with both men. I tried to sell the Clavivox in the studios in Nashville, but in truth, I just wanted to stay in contact with Raymond because in my life, I've maybe known two geniuses, and it's sort of like pornography. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. You know, one of them was my brother, I think truly a genius, and one was Raymond Scott. Different in kind, not in degree. This thing had a helical vein inside. I'll just describe it. And then the keys went up and hit that helical vein, and it rotated it angularly. And then at the end of it was a photoelectric frosted thing and a photoelectric cell. Graduated, I should say, from opaque to totally translucent. And so that's how the pitch works. So if you played a note here and then touched the other note, you could rock back and forth at any speed, and you actually had control over the speed of the portamento. Very unusual, you know, for that day, certainly. I do have a little bit of audio example, but it's rather poor. And I'd like to get onto some other things. Let's look at the Ondes Martenot, a very important instrument for several reasons. That's my favorite picture of the Ondes Martenot. Women, again, crowding out all the men. Come on. Let's hear it for men. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah.
What's important about the Ondes Martenot? A lot of things. First of all, there's about 400 or 500 compositions written for it. One of the problems with the synthesizer, since you never knew what it was, since you configured it and made a new instrument every time you did it, it wasn't a fixed thing in anybody's mind. Oh, I can write for the Ondes Martenot. I know what it'll sound like. You can't have a literature until an instrument does that in point of fact. And I think with the Continuum, we have a fighting chance of actually developing a literature. And I'll just say this flat out, and it's not because Lippold is here and I'm waxing anybody. I consider the Haken Continuum the culmination of Bob Moog's dream. That's the way I think of the instrument.
I agree.
Because as I'm going to point out a little later, I wish to take issue with this East Coast, West Coast mythology about, well, Buchla did controllers and Bob had a keyboard. Sorry. It's just incorrect. It's not factual. And I'll show. And I took notes. I didn't plan on talking about that, but it came up. What's also important about the Martenot is this. Critical. Here is the right hand selecting the pitch. The first Martenot did not even have a black and white movable keyboard. And it had a wire that you pulled, to change the pitch. There were a lot, again, like Lippold says, you go through all of these variations and prototypes. People who don't know about instrument manufacture, boy, did I resonate with that, Lippold. It's, my God, the level of detail. Every part in a synthesizer has a 16-digit code, and you have to buy it 18 months ahead of time, and it must be worse on the Continuum, The agency that selects the pitch, the right hand, is not the agency that articulates the pitch. That's the left hand. Why is that so important? Well, because on a piano, you could play legato, but you can't slur. For one thing, it's polyphonic. If I'm going to articulate a pitch, as I select a pitch, I have to articulate it with the same agency, one hand, okay? On the Ondes Martenot, I can play tie-ta-ta-ta, 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 tie-ta-ta, tie-ta-ta, because I'm articulating with one agency and selecting the pitch with another. Okay. By the way, I'll give credit to Dave Luce. I learned these concepts from David A. Luce, who worked at the Moog Company, and taught me aesthetic arguments are useless. They'll go on forever. Talk degrees of freedom. An airplane, it's got roll, pitch, and yaw. Okay. And if you've ever flown into the Buffalo airport when it's 50 miles an hour, you get a lot of yaw. And you go, oh. A violin bow is very similar, isn't it? Roll, pitch, and yaw. And it's got all these other degrees of freedom. Where you are on the bridge, the speed at which you do it, the force with which you pull down or go up, and some martelé and spiccato and all. It must have 12, 15 degrees of freedom. And I believe that's why, at least for me, I can sit and listen to an entire evening of string quartet music. And as I played trumpet with organs, pipe organs and stuff, but I generally am not drawn to an entire evening of pipe organ music. Not enough degrees of freedom, just personal, for my ears. But this is a critical idea, degrees of freedom. Okay? What else have you got? You got this ruban, this ribbon. It's a wire in the front. You see the player's fingers in this, and you move this way. And the advantage over a theremin is the theremin has no kinesiology. My God, but you see Clara or Rob or anybody that really do this, and it's like, yeah, C sharp is right there. How do they do that? Lots of practice and maybe perfect pitch. Do you have perfect pitch, Rob?
Tuesdays and Thursdays.
I have imperfect pitch. When I have a trumpet in my hand, I always know what the notes sound like. Anyway, here's what was also interesting about the Martenot, and I try to advise my students at Berkeley about this. Most people that call themselves synthesists or sound designers are quite happy of saying, "Oh, here's my stereo pair," or "Here's my 5-1," I forget what you call them, leads. Stick them where you want to. Any old speaker. Well, no self-respecting guitarist does that, do they? They play a Marshall Stack, a Fender Twin, a Peavey. They know what the voice of their instrument is, and they prefer that voice. Okay? Look at the Martenot. Here's the palm, like a big lute thing. It's driven from the back, and then these strings vibrate, and then it broadcasts. It's got this wonderful natural reverb. What's this? It's a gong. Same thing. It's driven from the back. You can play all the harmonics you want to through this gong, and boy, they'll come out inharmonic.
Are those like sympathetic strings?
Yeah, sympathetic.
They're sympathetic, absolutely. But all of them are driven from down here, from the back. Take a speaker cone off of a dynamic speaker, essentially. You can drive it.
Are they specified to be tuned to certain pitches?
I don't know that, and I wish I did. I've heard some people say no, and then I've heard other people say yes, the 12 notes of the scale.
Yeah, I've seen people retune them for different pieces, so some people must use that.
Yeah, and then there was a dynamic speaker. Everybody knows what that is. But wow, what an idea that we would worry about coupling to the air and how we do it. Not only that, we would start worrying about the room in which we're playing, which some of the people who did the earliest samplers had no clue about.
Their early theremins were somewhat like that too. See the very iconic kind of
the big speakers, the big dodecahedron or whatever they were. Yeah, so this is a very important instrument for me for a variety of reasons. It plays beautiful stuff. Let me just play you a little quickie here. Here's some sound of the Metalik, which a lot of people haven't heard. They hear the palm a great deal. Hang on. Let's try this. And then I think a little later,
It sounds like they had those tuned, that was built around tuned notes, so when they were doing that, like flutter up the D sharp E thing, that the E string was...
Yeah, but it's added the inharmonics of the Metalik. That's what I hear. Let's see what we got here. Sort of typical of the palm. You hear that in Taranga Lila, Messiaen.
Was one I was hearing, I thought that was a string thing. That wasn't the strings? That was the gong, the first thing that I thought was...
I think so.
Okay.
I didn't research it.
Well, I said forget about it.
It's strictly by ear, I've got some pieces here. We heard Arasan yesterday beautifully. Here's a piece that if we have a little more time, I'll indulge. But I want to get to the mainline stuff. Here is Lorneau doing a demo of envelope control. And again, what do you need? You need pitch deviation, you need portamento that's not terraced, and then you need real envelope control. As a matter of fact, when people talk about people's style, what are they really talking about? What differentiates one trumpet style from another? I don't think it's waveform, I don't think it's timbre, I think it's articulation and pitch deviation. Those are the two biggies. As Lippel pointed out, pitch deviation we have the greatest sensitivity to. Timbre, our sense of timbre is not really that good, A-B, but articulation and pitch are extremely, psychoacoustically very important. Let me let this guy talk.
For the volume, you have this device here that you press down. The more you press it down, give sound, which are almost very close to silence.
I noticed in some of the places in the Messiaen where the beginnings of the notes, the attacks are quite varied. And how do you control the difference?
Familiar, because this can be used slower or faster. If I do it, it's something like more lourde. Now I can make it more immediate. It could even be, but it's not in this sound. It could be even be this. Almost percussion.
Yeah.
You see, real musical instruments, and by that I mean things that have nuance, that's my definition, they have contextual management. Like when they started designing guitar synthesizers, I said, why would you do that? As a matter of fact, Bob Moog and I made fun, we talked to each other about it and made a joke of it, that he and I single-handedly kept Norlin, which owned Moog, from getting into the guitar synthesizer business. It drove the ARP company out of business. There's demographics and there's psychographics. Demographics is, how many keyboard players are there? 2 million. How many guitar players are there? 13 million. We got to get into guitar synthesis. No, there's psychographics. Different breed of cat. Guitar players won't put up with what you had to do with synthesizers in the early days. It was that simple. Some of us knew that. Bob and I knew that. And we single-handedly kept the Moog company out of that business. But that envelope control, this is critical. And listen to the Haken Continuum. I'm going to play part of this because all of you know it. Some of you have cited this as the thing that thrilled you and made you want to get a continuum. It did me. Can you imagine trying to program a group of envelope generators to mimic those envelopes? No, of course not. Fabulous. Okay, what do I want to say here?
How to get the other two surgically removed.
All right, very briefly, there was something called a Hellertion, pre-30s, a couple of years. What do these look like? Moog Ribbons, band manuals they were called, bolted to a piano. Here it is. Oh, what does that look like? Interesting.
What year is that, Tom?
About 1928, Hellberger and Lertis, it's a kind of a mashup, the Hellertion. Off the reservation. Let's try this.
In 1930, Friedrich Trautwein, a professor in Berlin, introduced the Trautonium. Trautwein's best-known collaborator at the time was Oscar Salomon. He still lives in Berlin, where we paid him a visit.
Dieses Spiel auf der Seite war schon
This use of an electronic string was invented by Professor Trautwein when he built his first Trautonium. It's a metal bar, a string,
Und dahinter
Behind is a box-cycle radio, which holds the Trautonium itself.
untergebracht war. Und wenn man nun
By making a contact between the string and the bar, you get a sound. Or in different places,
und wenn man auf der Seite entlang gleitet,
you can get a glissando
gibt es ein Glissando oder
or vibrato. Or of course, a vibrato.
Yeah, I'm fortunate to have met Herr Sala behind the Iron Curtain almost. I mean, you have to go to the S-Bahn, the U-Bahn. You go into the Eastern Zone, they got Uzis there. You know, it's easy to be an armchair liberal until you've seen the shards and razor wire on the wall. And I did. So, by the way, I'm a liberal. I'm just not an armchair liberal. We'll talk about that later.
It was interesting in that design. I was wondering why those key references were so high, but he wanted to be able to slide underneath.
Exactly. Sometimes he'd play on them, sometimes not. And I spoke very little German. He spoke no English. But we spent about 4 or 5 hours in his studio somehow communicating. You know, and I heard him play Paganini Caprices on this wire, literally.
Yeah, I saw him when he was very old, and I speak German, so it was a lot of fun. But I asked, like, why do you only have 3 of these tones per octave? Like, why so few? And he just said, well, the wire isn't quite linear enough, and he needs the marker, so he tunes them to usually used some major triad pitches or whatever he used.
Yeah, that's a good point. The wire really wasn't linear enough. He was incorrect in saying that he invented, the Trautonium. Hellberger and Lertis had that several years earlier. But one of the things I try to talk about as a historian is I never stray into the territory of who was first. Who was first implies, on the part of the person asserting that, a sort of an omniscience. Like, I know everything about this field and I know who was first? No. Also, I'm not a great man historian. A great man historian believes that kings and queens and what you studied in school is history. That's important. No, the evolution of inventions is what drives civilization and weather. Okay? It's much more mundane than people think. And also, things that impressed you when you were 12 years old is why you're doing what you do now in general. Most of us. I saw not Forbidden Planet, The Day the Earth Stood Still. Woo! Theremins, a couple of them. Oh, wow. I was so freaked out I couldn't believe it. It's like, oh yeah, I've got to find out about that, do something about that. Here's Trautwein. Early instrument, Telefunken instrument, Oscar playing the Telefunken, Mr. Sala at later years playing the mixture Trautonium. Oh, and by the way, why would you have band manuals to begin with? And why not a good old keyboard? Well, these were tube instruments, my friends, and tubes heat up and tubes cool off. And they are notoriously unstable for pitch. This was their solution. Well, yet I guess you'll have to play it by ear. Why not? That's how you play the trumpet, the oboe, the trombone, the bassoon, and you don't play equal temperament, by the way. Oh, I've got to play this. Wonderful Trautonium lick. The Baldwin Company actually built a few Trautoniums. They had the rights to it in the U.S. Let's hear this. This was from the old One Step Beyond. Okay, I'm told I had 5 minutes, and I'm going to truncate my discussion of stepless pitch instruments because I want to talk about something else, and I'm up here. Here's Bob Moog playing a theremin. Okay, I have several types. Here's Bob Moog's with the Trazor. Chris Stackack, what the heck is a Trazor? Here it is. XYZ controller. Okay, theremin. I think this is the multiply touch sensitive prototype, maybe. I don't know. But this idea of East Coast, West Coast. Let me talk about that just for a minute. I disagree that the distinction between West Coast and East Coast was machine music versus played music by the hand on a black and white keyboard. Not really the case when you consider there were a lot of East Coast guys. Who is this? Joel Chatterby. What's that? CEMS. Coordinated Electronic Music Studio. You see any keyboards? No. What do you got? Sequencer, joysticks. Okay. There were many East Coast composers that were doing so-called machine music. And when the Moog sequencer came out, Bob held off on doing it because Raymond Scott kind of had a version that he respected, Raymond. And he said, nah, I don't think I'll do that. I think it's Raymond's idea. When Don came out with it, then Bob said, okay, it's fair game. I'm going to do mine. And the idea, this discussion could go on a long time. I appreciate the previous speakers made some good points about varactors and stuff. There was salient difference between Buchla and Moog systems. But the crux of the matter was not, I believe, as stated. The crux of the matter was tonal versus non-tonal, not machine versus played. You could do machine or played on either one. People played the Buchla, they played the Moog. They machined the Moog, and they machined the Buchla sequencers. In other words, automated music. Not so much. That's not the crux. The crux is the Moog oscillator, and parenthetically the filter and the amp, had exponential control functions built into the circuit. Now, what does that mean? If you have a keyboard that's a constant current source and equal ohmic value resistors, which is an easy way to build a keyboard, you have 1 volt for this octave and 2 volts the next octave. Could be anything, but 3, 4, 5. Well, that's not how music works, boys and girls. That's linear, and music is exponential. Octaves double. They are multiplicative. They are not additive. Okay? So what do you have to have in front of your oscillator? An exponential function generator. Then when it sees this straight line from the keyboard, it exponentiates it, and you can play Western tonal, tuneful music. Okay? I was in Don Buchla's kitchen, and I asked him, I said, Don, are your control inputs on your oscillators, are they log or linear? And he had a wry smile. He says, well, they're kind of neither. Don Buchla didn't care about tuneful music. That's not what he was about. Okay? But I will say this, there's quarts and pints, and sometimes a quart can hold a pint, but a pint can't hold a quart. I'm privy to some interviews that have been done but not published, and a famous Buchla artist basically said, oh, I could have done what Wendy Carlos did, meaning switched on Bach on my Buchla. I beg to differ. Even if you got a linear keyboard or tried to tune the Buchla keyboard to a linear thing to where it would make sense, there's no exponential function generator on any of his. The 100, the 200, I defy people to go, it'll track over maybe about an octave. We talked about linearity a moment ago. Okay? Very important concept. So, East Coast, West Coast, painting with a broad brush, yes, the composers out of the West Coast tended to do more avant-garde music, at least the ones that got, or maybe the question should be, is it because Morton Subotnick got better press because he did None Such album, and Joel Chatterby was doing a lot of the same kinds of things, but wasn't as well known? No. It's about atonal versus tonal, and that's all about the actual technical aspect of the systems. Okay, and the artist, who I very much admire, made that statement, oh, I could have done that with my Buchla. simply didn't understand the technical part. And as I told Ed, it's so wonderful to have somebody like Ed, who is both a tool maker and a tool user. So, and just very quickly, I got this from Brian Kehoe. And then I'm done, Sally. These are some of the controllers that Bob Moog promulgated, okay? Keyboard manual. Only a limited mind would see it just as an organ keyboard. It can control anything if you know about CV. Computer control. When the first system was first finished, they used the D-to-A converter at University of Toronto to drive the modules. Antenna system for John Cage's Variations 5. Linear controller, the Ribbon. Sequential controller. Limited minds see the sequencer as controlling notes. Well, Don didn't think that either. I said, what do you think about sequencers? He said, they're fun if you play them very slowly and not make computer music, so-called. XY controller, XY pedal, microtonal keyboard, Boss & K version for one customer. Microtonal keyboard, drum percussion controller, 1130, touchpad controller, I guess that was the Trazor, art exhibit with photocell controllers, a matrix of push pins, a guitar interface, a violin interface, tested but never marketed, and a scale controller, most of them in the first 4 years. So, I don't say these things because I worked with Bob, I knew Bob, and I loved Bob. I say them as my dad, who was a commander in the Navy or something, retired. I only say it because it's so. Thank you very much.